all of you who made it here to the Adam Mickiewicz Salon at Collegium Majus in Poznań, and those of you in front of their screens, welcome to the second day of the Rebellious People Conference. Our first panel today will be moderated by the Dean of our faculty, Mr. Tomasz Mizerkiewicz, to whom I'd like to thank wholeheartedly for his support during the organization of our conference. Tomek, I'll give you the floor now. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Przemek. We officially open our today's sessions. Our first paper will be presented by a team of researchers of the Klaipėda University in Lithuania, represented by Gabriele Burbulyte-Tsiskarishvili, Jaroslav Dvorak, Indre Narbutienė, Alyvda Obrikienė, Remigijus Riekašius, Edita Stumbraitė-Vilkišienė. And the presentation is titled "Who Votes for Rebellious Politicians? Narrative Insights of Petra's Phenomenon in Lithuania." Ladies and gentlemen, the only mystery is, the big mystery is who the designated speaker will be on behalf of the team. And so we give the floor to you, and I think the speaker will be Ms. Gabriele Burbulyte-Tsiskarishvili.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you all. Thank you, Dean, for presentation of all our big group of the researchers. And today we are together here with my colleague Edita. So you can also see here those who are in the Zoom, who are connected during the Zoom. Right now, I will try to share my screen and to put the PowerPoint presentation. Just a minute. So I hope you can see it. Yes, everything is okay. So I will start my presentation in a couple of, in a moment. So actually, the title of the presentation is not very exact. We are analyzing not who, but in reality, why people are voting for rebellious politicians. And of course, it implies who as well. And what does it mean, Peter's phenomenon? Who is Peter in Lithuania? Peter in Lithuania is a very famous person, a very famous politician. And his phenomena is that he already is the 7th term in the parliament. Where does his success is? Why people are voting for him? Why is he so successful? We started analyzing his phenomena at the beginning of this year, and when we have sent you the abstract of our presentation, we wrote that we conducted a pilot survey, but today we are presenting you the freshest results, not from the pilot survey, but already from the original survey conducted during the whole time from in the spring, in the summertime, and currently. So 7th term in the parliament. Who is Peter? What makes Peter famous, and what makes him rebellious? Why he is rebellious? First of all, I would like to present how media presents him, how he is viewed in the public eyes in the whole Lithuania, in our country, not in that constituency where he is elected, but the whole Lithuania and especially media. First of all, he is the most famous of all our members of parliament as anti-LGBTQ+ activist. And his first appearance in the first Baltic Pride in Vilnius that happened in 2010 ended in his conflict with police officers. And here you can see the photos from that famous Baltic Pride. But he became more famous, even more famous, in the year of 2013 in the next Baltic Pride Vilnius. And he was arrested, despite that he is member of parliament. And when he was carried by the police officers, as you can see in the famous photos, he created a he cried, he created a motto that is quite famous right now in Lithuania: for Lithuania man, dla Litvy meščiniai. It could be translated so, už Lietuvą vyrai. And despite that he is fighting against the LGBTQ plus community, he actually all the time makes quite a scandal from all his campaigns. And right now you can see that since that famous Baltic Pride Vilnius 2013 action, he became a sign of all those who are against anti-LGBT. But why he is against LGBT? It's a completely different story from all the scandals. Actually, his anti-LGBT campaign roots, they go back to the 1990s, and his participation in the Christian Democratic Party. And right now it's a completely different story. It's quite it doesn't get into the context of this conference about the development of Christian democracy and Christian democratic ideology in Lithuania and the Party of Christian Democrats. It's split it several times, and it's a complete different story. I'm not telling about it today, but the roots of his activism against anti-LGBT goes quite into the beginning of the 1990s, and his roots in the Christian Democratic Party. But it's not only this scandal, his scandalic behavior is not the only one. He has illegal children. He appeared with a naked man during the online translation of Parliament Committee. Even recently, the most recent his rebellious actions were that he was quite active member of demonstrations that happened against the parliament. And we had several riots against parliament, and he participated in these riots. And despite that, people in these riots, they were arguing that the whole parliament should be closed, including him, as he is the member of the parliament. Nonetheless, he participated in these riots together with the people. And why I put all those photos, why I'm talking about him, I want you to see how we in Lithuania see this member of parliament, that he is really scandalous. He is very rebellious. He participates in almost all scandals, what could happen in Lithuania. But in all those scandals, he is trying to pose himself as anti-systemic fighter, a fighter against system, fighter against government that rules at that time. And the biggest question is, does or do voters vote for his scandalous behavior? Do they vote that he is so rebellious? What makes Peter famous through the eyes of voters? For reaching the answer to this question, we conducted a survey, and right now we have 31 interviews with the voters of the respective single-member constituency. who voluntarily declared that they voted for this candidate. Informants were selected using the so-called targeted and snowball selection methods. And having set the goal to find out the real attitudes of voters and the motives for choosing a candidate, we used the methodology of narrative research. Narrative semi-structured interview used as the data collection method. Narrative analysis used as the data interpretation method. That enabled us to reveal the factors of electoral success, and not only of the success, but potential failure, determining the longevity of rebellious political behavior. Because the question is whether he succeeds, if he succeeds in the next elections with his such rebellious behavior. And as our interviews reveal, that there is a potential that his glorious successful participation in elections is endangered. And what does these interviews reveal? So first of all, we grouped the current Peter's voters into 3 groups. The first group is the so-called loyals. They voted for Peter in the first and in the second rounds. And we call them fundamentalists or Taliban. Why they are voting for him? Because they are just saying that Peter is the best. Peter is the best. They are not even reading his program. They are fanatic, they are Taliban voters. And actually, when they are talking about argumentation, about the arguments why they are voting for Peter, they are as well saying that actually there is no one else to vote for. The second group is the so-called the second rounders. They voted for Peter only in the second round. Actually, most of them voted against, not for Peter, but against the other candidate from the Conservative Party. And again, they were saying, we are voting for Peter because there is no one else to vote for. And the third group are those who we call the disappointed. They were Peter's fans in the earlier elections of the parliament. But in our current elections that happened in 2020, they didn't vote in the second round, nor for Peter, nor for other candidate. They are saying already that we need new faces. They are bored with Peter and his scandalous, rebellious behavior. And even those people, they are also saying that anyway, there is no one else to vote for. Despite that, they are not already voting for Peter. They do not find any other candidates that could be voted for. And when we started analyzing all the interviews of the voters and how they see Peter, so we found out that we could use the image from the popular movie, how voters see Peter. They see him as divergent, they see him as allegiant, they see him as insurgent. What does it mean? How we found out that such is the narrative among Peter's voters. So first of all, allegiance. What does it make? What it makes him allegiant in the eyes of, or loyal in the eyes of voters? People usually emphasize his stability and consistency. And we especially put some quotations from the interviews that help to reveal his portrait in the eyes of voters. Usually people are saying that he is the straight man. He directly tells what is on his mind. And people are valuing that his views are clear. They know what they can expect from him, that he has his faith, his church, his religion since independence, as I told earlier from the 90s. All of that is positive, and he keeps it constantly. He doesn't change his point of view. He doesn't change his attitudes, and that's why people like him. Voters like him. Loyalty as well is understood from the point of visibility and attention. Why people value Peter so much in that particular constituency. If you talk to another constituency, of course, of the voters of another constituency, they don't see or hear the member of parliament. Once you elect him or her, you don't see it, him or her anymore during the 4-year term. And Peter is different. He is constant. His communication with his voters is very constant, and he is always talking with his voters and with his constituency members, and that's why voters like him, even if they not all the time like what he is doing. What elements are for divergence? Close versus unavailable. Voters always emphasized during the interviews that he's a very warm person. He doesn't look like member of parliament. He doesn't act like member of parliament while communicating with voters, with people who are living in that constituency. They are emphasizing that he doesn't look like those men of power who look at you from above. He is simple, he is human, he warmly interacts with every inhabitant of that particular district, whether that inhabitant is old, whether it is young, it doesn't matter for him. And he usually attends all the events of the constituency, and that's why people love him there. Through that communication, he creates a portrait, he creates a vision that he is the same as voters. He is not a stranger. And people, members of constituency, voters, inhabitants, they do not need to go to him. He comes to them. And as people say, he just knocks on the door and comes. In our homes, in our offices, in our shops, he visits everybody, he shakes everybody's hand. And that's how people see him, that he is sincere, not bossy, not someone from the so-called capital bubble. But all those scandals and rebellious actions, they cannot be without the effect as well. And his impulsiveness and his stubbornness and involvement in all those scandals actually what we found out from the interviews, that some of his most loyal voters, they are getting bored with such behavior. And some of them are saying that we used to be supportive for him, but not anymore. And this is the most dangerous thing, that despite that his popularity is quite much based on his scandalous behavior, but this scandalous behavior is natural for him, that rebellious behavior is natural. He, as I have talked with him several times, he says that I cannot do anything with it. When I see that there is injustice somewhere, I just need to fight with it. but not when you are in the policy, when you are in politics, when you are a member of parliament, you don't need to fight every fight that happens in the capital or in Lithuania as well. So this impulsiveness in reality right now is a biggest question whether it will help in the future or not for him to gain one more term in the parliament. For the other voters, actually those scandals have no effect. It is his life somewhere in the capital, and in that particular constituency, which is quite small in comparison with other constituencies in Lithuania. Only about 35,000 of people have voting right here. These people, they are not affected by his scandalous behavior, and they give priority to how he is behaving, how he conducts himself, how he communicates with them, with voters of particular constituency, not in the capital, not in the parliament. So what is the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that despite that in public media, Peter is presented as a very scandalous member of parliament, we can conclude that yes, he is rebellious, but particular voters of the particular constituency see him not as a rebellious man. They see him as a very familiar, a very warm person who is concerned with the living of his voters, with the everyday life of his voters, of everyday life of inhabitants of that constituency. So thank you very much. I know that I have that limit, the time limit is already, oh, it ended already maybe 10 minutes ago. So sorry. And this is the presentation of our huge research group. We are moving forward with this research, and actually it is the first research in Lithuania of such a type of people, members of parliament, and we hope that we will foster. We are starting, and we will foster the discussion about such kind of people in Lithuania, because in this area, in this field of studies and science, actually we have very very small amount of research. Thank you very much. I'm very sorry for taking your time, but I hope that you get the image about the most scandalous member of parliament. Just a minute.
Okay. Thank you, Gabriele. Thank you, Edita. Thank you for joining us and for your presentation. So now we could have the ability to compare your presentation with the presentation of Jan Sowa. So dziękujemy bardzo Gabrieli i Edycie za...
Thank you very much, Gabriele and Edita, for your presentation and for the presentation of the remainder of your team. Now we will give the floor to Jan Sowa of the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, who will speak on fascists, populists, and incels, how the right has taken over the culture of the class protest. Indeed, the time limit is 15 minutes, and please make sure that you stick to it rigidly. For sure, I do not envy your work as a moderator. You represent the people, however, so we do not want to channel our dictatorial tendencies here. I'll do my best to abide by the adopted rules.
Okay, let's hope that my device works.
Przed chwilą działało. O, teraz jest OK. Dziękuję bardzo. Przyznam szczerze, że
After the introduction, I must say that I proposed the topic somewhat provocatively. When reading the introduction of the organizers, I found there references to movements of protest, which I would put in a spectrum between conservative, leftist, and liberal mainstream. We have the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, we have the Maidan, the riots in Greece, the Arab Spring, the women's strike, the young people's climate strike, and the Yellow Vests. The Yellow Vests seem to stand out of the crowd, yet generally speaking, we could classify these protests in the range from conservative through mainstream liberal. I understood that the aims of these protests would be located mainly here, but again, I think we have too few research studies and too little reflection on extreme right-wing protests, rallies, referring to what Anna Radukiewicz spoke about yesterday. Has heard a presentation of the Committee for the Defense of Democracy on fascism in Poland, and when he arrived at the slide, which was supposed to translate to explain where it comes from, I'm sure you know those drawings which start with an ape and then gradually we arrive at a human being. And then there was one more drawing which showed a pig, and the conclusion was that that people are pigs, and that's why we have fascism. Well, we definitely need a far more profound reflection into the root causes for the mobilization of the right-wing movement. I'd like to flag from the start that these movements that I have in the title of my presentation, that is fascists, populists, and incels, they are just catchwords. The sense of the symptom is not in its position in the world of in the symbolic world, but in its relation to the real, to what it reveals. I'm intrigued less by what these movements are. I am more interested in why they emerge in the first place. Now, obviously, these movements have their unique particular features, yet they seem similar in their motivation and objectives. They are a conglomerate where they are in a relationship to one another. And a strategy of interpretation I'd like to suggest that speaks about the materialistic foundations. I wouldn't like to reiterate the claim of vulgar Marxism that there is only one social conflict, that there is only the class struggle. I believe that the mobilization of the right-wing movements have a different root cause. This is a very negative reaction to the emancipatory transition in the society. We heard about this yesterday. It seems, however, that we do not have that many attempts at understanding the materialistic underpinnings of right-wing movements, and we need to reflect on them as well. I will focus on one because, first of all, these are things that I'm interested in, and second of all, I believe that there is that such narratives are lacking. What seems new in a situation we're in now is not so much the content of the movements, because they can be linked to traditional, well-known demands, to xenophobia, misogyny, nationalism, and so on. And what new has happened is that these movements have shifted to
W nich takiego właśnie elementu buntu,
the
protestu,
element of protest, riot, rebellion, radical opposition, and disobedience. The right wing has always been more obedient rather than disobedient. It was the emancipatory movements that were disobedient. Now they shifted towards the right of the political spectrum, and because of that, these movements have now become mainstream and people's movements. Let me draw your attention to two phenomena or two aspects that need to be taken into consideration to understand the shift. This is a certain order of social change, and this is a shift of the political investment of ideological classes. Also, there is the taking over of emancipatory narratives by the right wing movements. On the left hand side of the political spectrum, we are less concerned with the materialistic aspects of existence, but with ideological agenda. And the left is now more and more linked to urban projects. We had a Starbucks factor, and it was discovered in a sociological study that the number of voters for the leftist parties increases along with an increase in the number of Starbucks shops in a town. I'd like to refer you to what Didier Ribon writes about in his book, Returning to Rain. In order to be able to emancipate, to be what he is, he had to withdraw or hide or stifle his class ideology, his class identity, of which he was embarrassed. And this seems to be linked to this shift of ideas, demands towards recognition and departure from distribution or redistribution. Another thing which is interesting in Ribon's book, Returning to Rain, is the political choices of his family members, parents and brothers. They are they vote for the National Front. They used to vote for the Communist Party. Now, what has happened? Due to the change, to the shift within the left of the political spectrum, there is an erosion of classical left-wing agenda, and now this aspect that could be embraced by the proletariat, by the oppressed classes, the ideological component is disappearing, and instead we focus more on recognition. And here, these people cannot find themselves. Now, moving on to the situation in Polish, these are very interesting results of research conducted a few years ago. I'm sure you know this. This research, this is an interesting way of presenting data because it helps us see a certain profile of the three main political camps let's have a look at two things. First of all, the gray line is the left, the brown or the orange one is the liberals. There are basically no differences between the left and the liberals. They have ceased to differ, at least in the voters' perception. I understand that within the parliamentary left, we have egalitarian, materialistic, emancipatory members of parliament. However, voters in Poland do not see any differences between the liberals and the leftists. And to me, this is also symptomatic of a certain defeat of building the left in Poland. People used to believe that the left will somehow germinate from the liberals in Poland, and this hasn't happened. This really hasn't taken off. Another important thing is, let's have a look at this point. This is the peak on the left-hand side of the diagram, the blue line. It's the peak of the diagram says the assurance of a high level of social security or social benefits. And here, the ruling party, the Law and Justice Party, ruling in Poland, is definitely comes first, and is perceived by voters as most caring for their needs. Also, in social investment instead of economic investment instead of social transfer, they are even more important for the left. This is here we have abortion. Abortion is on the right hand side of the margin. And a lot of the followers of the currently ruling party, they don't see the current rulings of the Constitutional Court as correct. Now, the most interesting thing is the peak of the left of the blue line. Also, something that Anna said yesterday: voters of the right are said to be stupid and they don't know anything, which is not true. I believe that it is the leftists and the liberals who may be enclosed within the bunker of a single medium, of a single television station, for example. And actually, voters of the Law and Justice Justice Party are more versatile when it comes to the use of different media. Now, another important aspect of the shift I am referring to here, this was the first thing, the social aspect, and now the ideological shift in the discourse of the right-wing politicians. The right wing takes over the language which was traditionally connected with emancipatory positions, connected with riots and opposition. And this is evidenced by the post-colonial theory in Poland of domination, of dominance, and subjugation. A person who is very strongly linked to this is Zdzisław Krasnodębski. The book he wrote, Postmodernist Stations of Culture, discusses, among others, the essence of European politics, or rather anti-European politics of the ruling party. Our approach to the mainstream of European culture is that we are going to be dominated by the mainstream of Western culture if we go too far in our integration with the West. So empirically, Krasnodębski is right because our traditional Sarmatian culture was definitely not a current of the Enlightenment, but rather it was against the Enlightenment, and our nobility was against any reforms as they believed they are alien to our culture. Our Sarmatian way of doing politics is far better and far different. And Krasnodębski says that this is really colonialism. He uses the rhetoric, and this is what happens in postmodernism, that anybody can appropriate different aspects. Krasnodębski says that instead of trying to integrate with the West, we should foster what is ours, what is Polish. And this is the emancipatory aspect of within the colonial agenda, right? We do not, we want to withstand the onslaught of Western culture, and we want to retain as much as possible our Polish local culture, virtues, and values. Okay, this is basically the thrust of my lecture. To conclude, I would like to say that we are dealing with a situation where groups which are subordinate cannot find themselves in the narratives suggested by leftist or liberal camps. They rebel against their own subjugation, which is again, the materialistic component is very important. It's interesting to look at the discourse of incels. In the past, hierarchies looked as follows. There were strong men, weak men, strong women, and weak women. And now the social hierarchy looks different. We have strong men, strong women, weak men. This is a nostalgic and conservative reaction to the emancipation of women. Okay, the emancipation of women is great. I don't want to sound any different. The problem is, however, that all of these formations are male rather than female. The biggest issue, the biggest problem is for men from lower classes, because they feel worse. They feel inferior because they are weak, and also they feel worse because they are poor. I don't think that the redistribution or the return to materialistic problems or demands will solve all the problems, but I believe until we draw these people from here to here on the slide, unfortunately, we don't see the slides, we don't see what the speaker is pointing to, so we cannot give you the exact names. We are going to have problems. So this is not an argument against the policy of emancipation. This is an argument against the left, which only sees the question of emancipation and recognition and does not heed the materialistic elements. And this leads to a shift of subordinate lower classes, especially men, towards right-wing formations, and it is the motivation for the right-wing rebellion. I do hope that we'll be able to tackle some other issues in the Q&A session. Thank you. As our researchers from Klaipėda, you almost used the time. Now, obviously, you can ask questions to our speakers from Lithuania and to Jan Sowa. Please, you can. If you have a question, please either drop us a line in the chat box or come up to the microphone in the room. Thank you so much. And all the speakers can also introduce themselves when asking a question. Thank you. Elżbieta Korolczuk. My first question is to to the situation in Lithuania, because I wonder how this political leader is linked to male movements. What is the correlation, or if there are some movements? I understand that there are some male movements and that there is some support for this politician, which is more organized. So this is my one question. What are the links? What are the linkages? And the second presentation, I have a comment. First of all, broadly construed gender. Feminist critics say that it's not the gender is not only recognition but also redistribution. And I was wondering whether we can make a division you made, limiting the questions like abortion to cultural issues. And another thing is the claims you make are well known. I agree with them because we have proof. Norris, for instance, showed the division between economic, materialistic agendas and cultural or redistribution and recognition. But this is not only, we can talk about this not only with respect to the Polish left, but also with respect to the right-wing parties. We have voters move out of the left and they vote for extremists on the right hand side of the political spectrum. But I believe that we are dealing here with a situation where voters are increasingly less motivated by their economic interests. So the entire system of political vote moves towards cultural or ideological issues. When we look at the US, for instance, views on migration might be a better predictor of who the voter will eventually vote for, rather than their class position or economic status. So we deal with a shift of the left voters towards radical right, but at the same time, there is a shift in their view of their interests from thinking in terms of their economic status towards cultural agenda. How do we change that? Because the problem is that in Poland, possibly also in Hungary, what the right has done and what is responsible for its success is that the right has shown itself as the defender of the people against neoliberalism, as both in economic terms and such things as individualism, the rights of the individual, and so on and so forth. So how do we deal with that? Because if our left-wing parties try to speak about economic issues and human rights or individual rights, this does not translate into its perception in the voting population, because in the general perception there is no link between, say, individual rights, women's rights, and economic rights, and this is something that feminism tries to catch up with. Okay, perhaps we could start with the answering.
Thank you very much for the question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. So actually, Peter's phenomena is that it is not connected absolutely with feministic or anti-feministic movements or male movements at all. It's a completely different narrative, as I try to emphasize, but it's out of my presentation. It was out of my presentation that this Christian democratic roots and Christian narrative is the main. And despite that he fights against the LGBT community, his own lifestyle, he has a legal child outside of the wedlock. And even at the very beginning, when he found out that he has that child, he proposed an abortion. It's his personal life doesn't affect voters, but it is not connected at all with male movements or feministic narratives. It's a bit different story. So I'm not taking your time anymore. If you have more questions, so you're free to ask, but it's not connected with male movements.
This is very important explanation. Thank you much. Bardzo dziękuję, Gabriele, za to wyjaśnienie bardzo potrzebne.
Thank you so much, Gabriele, for this clarification. And right now, I'd like to invite Janek Sowa to the pulpit.
Zapraszam tutaj sobie, może ja usiąść i zapraszam, skoro jest to takie trochę ad vocem i w nawiązaniu do poprzedniego pytania, tak?
And we have a follow-up question, it seems, from Mr. Kościelniak. My question refers to the narrative you presented with reference to right-wing movement, Janek Sowa, and their takeover or heist of leftist voters after 1989, and that the analysis of the root causes of this phenomenon is really important in the context of political analysis of the public spectrum. My suggestion is a little bit different from your understanding of solidarity, because you see it as a movement with communist roots. But right now we know that right-wing movements in Poland also hearken to the solidarity movement, but reinterpreted it according to right-wing rather than left-wing narratives. So this is tied to the ties with the Polish Catholic Church and its own interpretation of the solidarity movement, which overlaps with that of the right-wing political sphere in Poland. But when you take a look at the archival photographs of the solidarity protests in the 80s, even those published in the Western press, these are inextricably tied to Catholic imagery, with the Pope, crosses, Virgin Mary's representations, and so on. And even Cardinal Wyszynski back at the time said that well, our workers do go to confession and they also pray, which was a point of bewilderment for the Western press. So it seems that it is a particular and peculiar phenomenon that is idiosyncratic to the Polish working class, that it was not very secular, but it was highly religious, and we also should mention the fact that our working class was so conservative that even at a 1979 convention, there were mentions of no tolerance towards any so-called deviations and from the heteronormative dominant. So I guess for our understanding of where we are and how we critically look at the solidarity movement, we should dabble with a little bit of historical revisionism of the dominant narratives. Thank you. And I've got another question to Gabriele. My question is whether politicians of other political options, other parties, are characterized based on this single parameter of proximity or directness of contacts with their base, with their voters' base, because we've heard that several times in your presentation that he descends among the average Joes and intermingles with them, visits them in their stores and their businesses, and is one of them or presents himself as one of them. And my question is whether other parties, whether progressive or liberal or others, there are any such politicians who, similarly to Petras, practice this daily contacts and are in relationships with ordinary people. Because if not, then it could probably be one of possible answers to the political success behind the Petras phenomenon, which could boil down to the fact that aside of these scandals, rows and riots, this man diligently knocks on people's doors every day, 8 hours, and so on. I don't know whether that's a sham or that's his actual policy. And my question to Janek would be, in terms of recognition and redistribution and the rigid difference between these categories, doesn't it blur the key issue of rights? Because if we think of recognition in terms of recognition of homosexual identity, then it is not about cultural issues, but about the existential safety of a human being that is protected by law or not. And therefore, I took the liberty last night to speak of a terrible schizophrenia of Polish public life, which separates political rights from social rights. So do we use two different languages to speak of two different cases, or did you mean something else when you referred to recognition? So in other words, would you be inclined to reconsider using the term recognition and replace it with the recognition of human and civic rights? Okay, we will first give the floor to our Lithuanian colleagues and then to Janek.
Thank you very much. Actually, yes, when we started interviewing voters, we found out that the proximity, his proximity, Peter's proximity to the voters is really the main factor, the main key of his success. And actually, we haven't heard that any other member of parliament was so near or communicating on everyday basis with his voters. And we also ask that question if he is sincere in his communication, or maybe just a role, a pose, a key to the success. He knows that it's a key to the success and he's trying to communicate. No, people say, voters say that for them, it seems that he is really sincere. And that's why they appreciate him and value him more than other, maybe sometimes even better in terms of profession, in terms of political parties, to the other candidates. His sincere communication with the voters, it is really the main key to the success, and that is the key to win again and again and again single-member constituency.
If I can add a few words just to Gabriele's, what he said, really in the past we had more politicians, which we can call as rebellious politicians. But what is the difference? That none of them reached the same success as we see on the Peter's phenomenon. That is the question, that it's not enough to be rebellious politician. It's not enough to be successful. The main key, as Gabriele mentioned, is that you should work as politician with your voters. And especially you should do this all the time, not only once per 4 years. So, and that is the reason what we want to explore and to find out where are the key moments, what creates the success in political scene. Maybe it's not enough to be visible in public or in media if you're just making scandals, and that's all. But the phenomena, what we see, is more connected not only with these scandals or rebellious actions, it's connected with his daily work, what he's doing with his voters, that he's connecting in everyday life and he's trying to solve the problems of his voters. And why not to vote for him if nobody else is doing the same? And today we have in power the political power for which is in parliament, it's for liberals and conservative parties. But Peter is independent, as he is declaring that he is not connected with any party now. And of course, it's his plus, because people like politicians who are not connected with political parties, because they think maybe they are better than all of them. But anyway, the roots, as Gabriele already stressed that they are in the conservative wing and Christian this wing. It was, we had in Lithuania a conservative party and plus Christians. So it's like he's declaring the values of conservative wing, but really he's acting as the left-wing activist. And it's very strange in such a way that people really believe more in what he's doing than in that what is really the main political, values in political level. That's all what I wanted to add.
Yes. Thank you, Gabriele. Thank you, Edita. Jan Sowa.
Dziękuję, Gabriele. Dzięki, Edyta i Jan Sowa.
Thank you so much. I am grateful for the comments and remarks. Now, starting from the gender issue and materialism, I fully realize, and you are absolutely right, that the way gender studies do not focus solely on identity and recognition. Selma James is one of my favorite authors who has, since the 1970s, shown the class dimension of the position of women. And they make a distinction between productive and reproductive work. But the problem is that gender for us is something else from the academic position, and gender as a social movement, as a social and political movement, perceived in the mainstream of political life is still something else. Let me give you an example. Some 3 years ago, during the Women's Congress, we had a very interesting discussion between Magda Świetlik and Magda Środa. They were saying that the women guards, women security guards who worked during the Women's Congress had to stand all day. And Magdalena Środa, Professor Środa, said that she also has to stand all day because she is giving interviews. Now, this shows a classic lack of sensitivity. Another issue is Kinga Duni, when she was referring to women in a factory beaten by security guards with truncheons. She said that these security guards are my enemy. Now, so gender studies is an academic discipline with a huge spectrum of issues and subtleties is something else than the mainstream gender in political life. Another issue is xenophobia and material or economic issues. I believe that to a large extent, xenophobia of the people who vote radical right is linked to the fact that the principal mechanism of social integration is the labor market. This labor market is ruthless, competitive, and people in an unacceptable way fight. They eliminate the competition, they fight for survival. Because what are the odds that a migrant who wants to reach Poland is going to compete with us for a job? But the probability is 0. However, if you work as a taxi driver, as a courier, work in a factory or in a supermarket, the probability is quite high. So my ideology is my worldview is something, but I do not run any risk. These are ethical issues, but diverse society is more interesting to live in. But for the lower classes, this is actually a question of competition. They fight for their jobs. And from this point of view, I believe that the materialistic economic component in xenophobic choices is very powerful. I'm not going to blame the people for being bad. They are rather a product of a situation in which they find themselves. And that's why the redistribution policy is not going to solve everything. We need to educate these people. But if you are going to feel fear, we might be educating them till our death, and this will have no effect. There was also the question about solidarity. You know what? I believe that the component you are talking about was there. You spoke about the gates of the Gdańsk shipyard. This is very symbolic. The problem you're referring to is more of an image of solidarity that was constructed after 1989. The gate has been reconstructed now. I have a picture. I have 2 pictures of this gate, what it looked like in 1980 during our strikes, and now. Today, the religious symbols are enlarged, and there is no element now. The banner, proletarians of all countries unite, there is no more banner above the shipyard gate, and this is also very symptomatic. This shows that the proletarian ideas have been marginalized, and you expose religious elements. Primate Wyszynski's approach to solidarity was by no means affirmative from the start. At the very beginning, when the strikes broke out, he said that each occupation should perform well their duties. And this was, in fact, a call to finish strikes. The church was afraid of the solidarity from 1980, 1981, because it was not controlled at that time. Titenbrunn was dealing with the question of the presence of religious rituals and symbols in Łódź, where there was no sit-in strike. The meaning of religious rituals and signs was far less important. Holy masses were a kind of mobilization. We grouped together when morale sapped. And this is the...
Czcimy sam swój fakt bycia razem, ducha wspólnoty, nie? Więc
and this was what we do not find anything in the program of the solidarity, the fight with abortion. If you could... In the demands put forth by solidarity, there is nothing about the right to abortion. It wasn't part of the program. And one more thing, in response to what Przemek asked me about, I believe there is a marked difference between identity, the way it functions, and the policy of recognition or redistribution. Identity requires recognition. You want to be proud of who you are. You want to self-affirm. From this point of view, class position is identity for rich people. A young person does not want to be proud of who they are. They want to stop being poor. So the position is different in the policy of recognition and identity. And the class problem, the solution of the class problem is something else. That's why Marx believed that the proletariat is universally revolutionary. The proletariat means to destroy hard work. The aim of the bourgeoisie is the whole world to follow its rules. The whole discourse of human rights. Yesterday we spoke about the civil society, and I believe that this is rather abstract and naive. For me, human rights are not civil rights. People who should have civil rights, who should have human rights, do not have them because they are stateless persons, or they don't have the right to citizenship. This is more of a demand, of a postulate, than reality. The key here is the difference between identity and class when it comes to its direction. Do we want to affirm and be proud, or do we want to leave the position we are in and destroy it? Obviously, the poor do not want to be embarrassed of being poor, but they do not want to be proud of it either. Thank you so much. Perhaps they want to be proud of performing work. Again, the aim is to perform work, and this has always been the aim of revolutionary ethics. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our colleagues from Klaipėda. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation, for your participation in the debate. And now I am thankful to Tomasz for the Dean of our faculty for moderating the panel. And now we'll have a short coffee break and we'll meet in 15 minutes from now.
who is a theatrologist, literature critic, and theater reviewer, working on theater in Poland and Central and Eastern Europe, and his paper will be indeed devoted to theater as animator, participant, and archivist of social rebellions in Central and Eastern Europe. I will, says Piotr Dobrowolski, keep my panel referred mostly to Poland, but also the neighboring countries. I'm not sure if I'll be able to give you a detailed account of all the phenomena delineated in my paper, but I'll do my best. In November 2013, millions of Ukrainians rebelled against Viktor Yanukovych's politics. This largest political movement in the history of Ukraine and to date was sparked directly by the president's refusal to ratify the signatory contract with the European Union, opening the way for the country to towards closer integration with the community. Now, the most expected but unperformed change of policy internationally caused many Ukrainians to put their lives on the line in defense of the political values and against the power of police and the military. Then we had demonstrations of women and women's strike in 2016, which was sparked by rigid anti-abortion laws that were intended to be put in place by the newly elected Law and Justice Party in Poland. Women protested in the name of not only maintaining the status quo, which was the so-called abortion compromise, but to expand abortion laws. Then we had the 2020 protests after the tribunal, constitutional tribunal under the leadership of Julia Przyłębska passed a verdict tightening these anti-abortion laws, which has already brought first victims. In Poland, we've had a number of protests and demonstrations. However, the original force and ferocity has weakened. Unfortunately, representatives of different age groups, social groups, and so on have expressed their defiance against infringements of their reproductive life, against the breaking of the rule of law, violating the rights of minorities, disintegration tendency in relations with the EU, and interventions in different walks of life, and ever more weakly. Unfortunately, the effect of these rhetorical demonstrations, the largest of which attracted hundreds of thousands of protesters around the country, have not met with any response whatsoever from the government. Recently, one of the Polish politicians has voiced his nostalgia for the Middle Ages publicly and the supposed liberties of the people that they were, according to him, granted to the white population. Now, we've had these waves of protests across different countries that differed in terms of their themes, but were similar in scope. The only one that was successful was the Euromaidan in Kiev that was quickly overshadowed by the Russian aggression in Donbass and the annexation of Crimea and the decisions of the subsequent authorities of Ukraine. In light of our yesterday's discussions, I would like to consider the ways of storing and rekindling social outrage whenever it fails to bring the intended effects and disintegrates and undergoes an entropy and succumbs to resignation and fatigue. So do those individuals, those political representatives elected in the 2015 elections feel and respond to our anger, or do we in fact remain powerless against their political decisions? Are these protests efficient or inefficient, and do they in fact create an overpowering sense of trauma? So is it only through backlash of power and right movement that political change can be instituted in these times, or are social protests organized from the grassroots also going to be effective? We can assess them through the prism of the Euromaidan and the Polish protests. What I'm interested in is the performative aspect of these protests, not so much in their individual or particular artistic representations indigenous to these different countries, but rather their motivations and goals and their implementation. Collective social manifestations, as better addressed by Dariusz Kosiński, if he wanted to address this topic in his paper. We know that these social collective manifestations, and demonstrations can evolve into a performative effect. These communities are momentary and fleeting, and without a rigid frame of reference, they disintegrate. What also disintegrates is the physical involvement and contact, intellectual relations and emotional responses, and the potential of the audiovisual sphere during protests, which cause these modern performances of dissent, as described by Guy Debord. What happens after we lose our voice as a result of continuous shouting, once we are swept by torrential rain, and once we get back home disenchanted and fatigued? Can we transcend the capitalist rule of transaction? Can we harness it for more than individual promotion? Individual promotion that does not preclude actual emotions and the need for actual change. Theater can be treated as a model example of performative action. In the context of protest, I'd like to inspect it as a social manifestation of culture that involves both the theater practitioners and rebellious people. I will not be referring to protest against theater pieces, because that will be the topic of Dmytra Semenovich's presentation. Neither am I going to promote a utopian theater community that is capable of taking particular actions in the public sphere. However, I should also mention Imas Portici, an opera composed by Ober, which refers to the popular uprising of the people of Naples against the Spanish rule. The piece that premiered in Brussels De La Monnaie Theatre and sparked the Belgian Revolution in the 19th century, once the audience responded to Oxarmes shout by the tenor, "Death to the Dutch," shouted the audience. Then the theater performance was interrupted. The audience left the theater and incited many more to join in, which initiated a successful uprising and the banishment of the Dutch from Brussels. And Victor Rubin's performance of Dziwki Stanu, a piece presented in Bydgoszcz and appealing for the recognition of human and civic rights with reference to the French Revolution, and Maria Janion's essay Boginie Wolności, dlaczego rewolucja jest kobietą, was staged only 4 weeks after the Polish women's strike took to the streets in 2016. Michał Korkow's stage design featured the tens of different banners featuring slogans used in the demonstrations, and at a certain moment, actresses performing on stage broke out of their characters and communed with the audience, breaking the so-called fourth wall of the theater, but also taking the theater out of its performative stage dimension onto the political one. Similarly, other pieces also combine the actual anger and performance of individual rebellion within theatrical frames. Sometimes these pieces performed in the streets featured random passers-by who joined in the demonstrations spontaneously performed by the actors, following which the actors would return to the stage and finish these pieces. So it seemed that many people were still very much involved in the spirit of protest sparked by the women's strikes of 2016 and joined in these performances, even though these were strictly theater pieces and many tried to reduce them to such. And similarly, Oliver Frljić's theater can leave an intellectual deposit in the minds of viewers and influence political reality to a certain extent, as evidenced by selfies and posts from different demonstrations accompanying the performances of Frljić's piece that were a testament to one's involvement in the protest. Feminism, not fascism, was the slogan of the second Forum of Culture at the Powszechny Theatre in Warsaw, and there was an overarching theme of the 2017-2018 artistic season. Can theater be a paragon of involvement for social organizations and cultural institutions pointing to the directions of social revolution? And there are many cases in point from Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. I will not be able to mention them all, so I will stick to Ukraine, but I'll only mention a handful of the examples that I have researched in detail, pointing to the possible reactions of these pieces in Ukraine in their social context. So very briefly, after the 1991 transformation of Ukraine and regaining of its independence, according to those who participated in the Ukrainian cultural scene, there was a brief period of creative carnival, which saw the opening of a number of theaters, the so-called studio theaters that, however, due to their unsuccessful commercialization, folded soon afterwards, many of them at least, and theater, at least in the first decade of in the last decade of the 20th century, promoted post-colonial and post-imperialistic methodologies targeted at the Soviet Union. As I said, the commercialization of the cultural scene rendered the continuity of these practices impossible, and many of these theater companies were transformed into academic theaters sponsored by the states. Those which were not lucky enough to undergo this transformation failed and closed down. Between 1998 and 2005, 4 volumes of new dramatical pieces were published. Poland only saw 2 such volumes, so this is very telling. The first of these volumes was titled Waiting for Theater, and this waiting continued for the next several years. Some argue that it has continued until today. The second impulse for the explosion of creative potential was the Euromaidan of 2014, which saw the involvement of artists, of theater artists, in the protests against Yanukovych's Eastern policy and the tightening rule of the former Ukrainian president, and helped propel the organizational model postulated by artists during the Euromaidan events. Most importantly, there was direct involvement of artists in the protests, such as performances on the Maidan stage or organization of Christmas plays during the Christmas season, as well as many concerts and spontaneous improvised pieces. Ukrainian documentalists tried to record and feature these events, as evidenced by Natalia Wróżba's Maidan Diaries, launched in the fall of 2014. The commitment of theater artists to this liberal revolution sparked a statement from Neda Bżdana, who said that culture fought for Ukraine's soul. This sentence remained very much in vogue in the next few years after the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Donbass, also attaining new anthropological meaning. However, the young Ukrainian theater stage opposes to such practices not so much due to nationalistic backlash, but through projects that initiate dialogue between eastern and western parts of Ukraine, and trying to unearth the reasons for this inner conflict and the tensions between the two parts of the country. Perhaps this non-nationalistic but rather dialogic response and opening to conversation on the social plane can serve as a case in point for the solution of social conflicts. The feeling of rebellion, when quashed, undergoes trauma and pathologizes itself, provoking, as Piotr Dobrowolski says, a creative self-transformation. Both these successful and unsuccessful protests against power can be seen as a composition of three elements: a feeling of loss and attempted compensation, individual and communal, and a self-transformation at the social level. Can it be treated as a basis of collective identification at the political level, or is it a testament to a political failure or accumulation of emotion and growth of post-traumatic sentiments? This is very poignant in terms of being a cultural stimulant of self-value, which is accompanied by the transformation of hierarchy of individual and communal sentiments. Now, evolution of theater might be an indicator of social transformations too, perhaps at the level of pointing to the constructive effects of social rage and its energy, which remains untapped to this date. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now our speaker will be Dorota Semenovich, who will speak about shame, anger, theater. Why do people protest outside theaters?
Dzień dobry.
A very good morning to all of you. I will move to a different area, both as to the subject matter and geographically. I will refer to Exhibit B. Exhibit B of a white Southern African as of 2010. Exhibit B by Brett Bailey's was exhibited in many parts of Europe. It was pretty controversial. Perhaps it was only in Wrocław in Poland where it didn't provoke any controversy, but it was protested, vividly protested against in London. Black UK residents held pickets outside of Barbican Centre, which finally scrapped the show of Exhibit B in London.
Możecie go zobaczyć na ekranie w postaci slajdów. Zresztą jest to PDF przygotowany przez samego twórcę. Projekt składał się tylko króciutko.
Very briefly, this was 12 stations. Could we start the slideshow? Perfect. There were 12 stations, installations, performative installations. It showed all the atrocities performed by Europeans in Africa. These stations were recreated on the basis of documents, historical documents found in many African museums. These images from the past also included references to current migration policy, linking the past and present inequalities and injustices. A major part of the show, which we cannot see in these pictures here, the viewers could trace the exhibits, could trace the movements of the viewers who entered the exhibition in small groups or individually. Now, the protests held in London against the project seemed pretty astounding, given that the artist wanted to highlight the injustices of colonialism and its present-day incarnations. The artist wanted to instill embarrassment and shame in the viewers. Shame and a sense of guilt appear in almost all reviews by white reviewers, which I analyzed a few years ago in an article I published in Didaskalia, a theater journal in Poland. However, there was some other shame that the artist did not foresee. Both the Black community of London and the defenders of the performance referred to the same values. That is, the values of a pluralist, solidarity society. They objected against all forms of oppression. However, they arrived at this position from different views, from the elite and the privileged group, as well as from excluded groups. And there were different rules that somehow linked the two communities. Now, I would like to ask about the limits of the category of shame. The reviews indicate that the emotions of the white viewers were linked to their finding themselves in a situation of a culture that used to oppress the colonized lands, and the recognition and the shame evoked by Bailey was due to a very graphic recapture, a very graphic presentation of those colonial exhibits from the past. White viewers in this position were put in the shoes of 19th century burghers, rich people. They showed Black people who were treated as exhibits, as objects on display, on show. And as white viewers, they were observing Black actors at an exhibit. This was also the power, the strength of this performance. Bailey strengthened the sense of empathy. That is, the Black body was here, a vector, a vehicle of the memory of humiliation, the memory of suffering. It conveyed the historical experience into the here and now. The Black body was the exhibit, the eponymous exhibit. And the Bailey's reference, and he highlighted the emotional perception of the work. He wanted to sensitize viewers, his audiences, to respond to these works of art. This was his work was meant to be a form of catharsis, or it was to trigger a catharsis. And all of this changed. All of this framework changed when the Black viewer came to see Exhibit B by Bailey. And in these viewers, it provoked a sense of shame. The shame of the Black viewers was founded on the identification with the humiliated victim. It's the work of art recreated the trauma. It recreated the humiliation, intimidation, and guilt. Scholars Sashiv see shame, embarrassment, sense of guilt, humiliation, this whole group of emotions as shame was for these scholars the common denominator of this whole group of emotions, such as embarrassment, guilt, intimidation, and humiliation. And the common feature is experiencing their own visibility, one's own visibility, how we are perceived by others. And most contemporary scholars refer to Helen Bloch-Levis, who in the 1970s differentiated between a sense of guilt and shame, indicating that a sense of guilt it refers to a particular action and its outcomes, while shame refers to the features of a particular person. So shame touches upon the very identity of the person, and its sense is even more acute. Now, when we experience a sense of guilt, it is triggered by an act we performed in the past. And obviously, this is a negative assessment of oneself, but is linked is closely linked to a particular act from the past, but does not need to be that acutely felt. So Helen Levis pointed out to a difference between the two, and also to a different perception of these two phenomena. So shame, a sense of guilt, is or can be Sarah Ahmed also wrote about this, and Thomas Schief also stresses this aspect of the sense of guilt. The shame of the stronger person aims at closing grief and aims accepting the past. It is linked with the guilty person himself, and this is what happens in Exhibit B. It excluded those who were excluded. So this was geared to the sensitivity of the white viewer. The black viewers saw the humiliation experienced by their ancestors, and they felt the same kind of humiliation themselves. Anger, wrath was felt by the black community, and that's why we have the pickets and rallies held in London. An assault that is a form of defense against embarrassment, against shame, which transmogrifies into pride. Now, the fact that we had pickets and rallies in London, and the fact that the the show of Exhibit B was scrapped is also underpinned by the political agenda. It's not only related to the multicultural aspect of London, because Paris is also pretty much multicultural, but it was only in London that the show was protested against. Maybe I can refer to it later too. Now, to conclude, now how do we use Exhibit B to understand better the sense of shame in performative arts? One thing is shame itself. Exhibit B shows that shame is part of the ongoing game of frequently contradictory social interests. It's not only an emotional state that is felt by an individual viewer, but following Sarah Ahmed, it mediates in the relationships between the individual and the community. It has a variety of incarnations, and the strategy of embarrassment, which is sometimes used by artists, must take into consideration the differentiation. Otherwise, the project is going to exclude someone. Secondly, protests aimed at Exhibit B seem especially interesting because they reverse the currently dominant recognition in Poland that theater is progressive while visual arts are not. In London, we have people demonstrating to be heard. We see here a merger of fear, of shame. How do people react to my own image? And this is somehow related to the development of one's image and the development of discourse on it. So from the Polish perspective, we can see that the London protests try to revalue the many conflicts that are present in today's communities. Thirdly, and finally, the protests in London showed that in 2014, multicultural artistic projects in multicultural metropolises were made in and for the sake of the privileged classes. The Black community was excluded, and this is the argument they used. They claimed they were excluded from the production, from the reception of these works of art. And Brett Bailey actually referred to these issues in the texts that accompanied the work of art. However, he didn't recognize himself that he was somehow perpetuating this state of affairs. I did not follow the repertoire of many London or Paris-based theaters. I often go to international theater festivals, and I feel that currently these theater festivals do reflect ethnic diversity of the societies where they are born and which they serve. I didn't manage to speak about the other case and the 2017 scaffold project. It is referred to in the abstract, and I will be able, I will be able to. Thank you so much, Darek. You are with us, I understand. We will have another online presentation. Dariusz Kosiński will speak about From the Cross to Lightning Bolts, the representational and performative effectiveness of protests on the basis of selected Polish events of the 2010-2020 decade. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm not actually with you live, and I'm sorry for the situation that prohibited me from coming here for personal reasons, but I'm nonetheless glad to be able to join you online. Hopefully, I will be audible enough. From the Cross to Lightning Bolts is my abstract title. I guess that the project was a little bit overambitious given the temporal limitation of my today's time slot. So yeah, I'll stick to the topic, but I'll try to make it a little bit briefer. I have dealt with representations for many years, and I had devoted a whole chapter to them in one of my latest books, and in Teatra Polskie, Rok Katastrofy is devoted to the said phenomenon of representational and performativity effectiveness of protests, but I usually dealt with protests as performances, and I'd like to differentiate between the Polish words staging and performance. So representation and performance, przedstawienie and performance. These two phenomena use different frameworks, different dramaturgy that I have been fascinated with, and that also determines the stage design and other theatrical aspects and elements of protests that tie in with theatrical methodology and competences used in theater studies and transposed onto the domain of social protests. It's a huge theme, as you may imagine, that could probably yield a conference of its own. I think that failing to acknowledge the representational and performative character of protests well, tends to oversimplify their complex character. Still, my today's presentation today will be referred to performativity of protests and the original input of Polish humanities into global humanities as a concept of performativity as developed at the Performativity Studies Department of the Jagiellonian University, where I work myself. The department was recently renamed given its research shift. So it's not so much about performances as performativity itself. The department no longer deals with theater performances in and of themselves, but rather in performativity as a process and phenomenon of production of meaning. I'd like to start with Konrad Wojnowski's definition of performativity in our co-edited Performatica Territoria, and Konrad tried to extract from the depth of different aspects of performativity as it is understood in different contexts, a certain significance that featured two understandings of performativity. First of all, he saw performativity as a construct groundlessness, which can be read ontologically and epistemologically as a postulate of a non-existing source of an research phenomenon, which is not so much exists, but rather is created by the context researched by the performer. And the second one was performativity as agency of a given phenomenon or object, that is the attributed power of actively shaping its surroundings. I am more preoccupied with the second meaning, so Wojnowski says that this understanding of performativity refers to agency and power that is usually attributed to phenomena or things that have been understood as passive so far. They are attributed agency mostly thanks to their inanimate origin. So performativity reduced to agency can be attributed to discourse itself, but also to the phenomena that we want to consider in their active productivity. Now, in the context of our today's ruminations, protests, that is, we can say that performativity as agency means that we do not speak of agency of actors, but of performativity of protests themselves as a form of action. It is protests rather than actors that take their place and are rudimentary for their performativity. I'd like to put forward a thesis that might be risky because it goes against the grain of the popular understanding of agency of protests, as referred to by Piotr Dobrowolski earlier today. It is that a successful process is that which brings change that it postulates. To me, agency of protests is not about getting a thing done, but rather protests themselves do not get things done. Obviously, this is repeated by politicians. Protests are no way or no means of solving problems or of instituting change. In order to do it, you have to win elections, get people to subscribe to your ideas, change the legislation, and then perhaps sit at the negotiation table or do anything else that is associated with realpolitik. So a protest is a feast, a carnivalesque theatrical performance, a glitch in the reality, which then takes over, and we get back to business as usual. We know that theater is successful for sure. It can institute certain changes, at least with reference to those who attend theater, to its audiences. This ties in with the understanding of the protest as a performance. It is said that protests can express, demonstrate, or manifest something. All three words point to the performative character of protests, manifestation and demonstration in particular. They can do what they can't do. They cannot achieve performative acts themselves, but they can only instigate them or inspire them. So after a wave of protest, we have change in the common understanding, at least. We should also consider the performative agency of protests, which involves production of something in the course of a performance, or the protest in this case. And this is my second thesis, that protest is performative regardless of the direct effect involved in its goal or declared objective, aside from its capacity to inspiring change or triggering change, protest itself sparks something new or triggers something new. And it was about this particular kind of performativity that Judith Butler wrote in Notes toward a Performative Theory of Assembly. Well, speaking of a performative aspect of gathering is what Judith Butler underscores in her consideration of fragile bodies gathering in a public space and establishing a particular community that determines the effectiveness of a protest. And it also establishes the political agency and empowerment that reshaped the entire visual sphere. Well, I'm sure that you know Butler's notes towards a performative theory of gatherings, in which fragility and powerlessness play key role as critical categories. Butler writes of fragile bodies that establish an alliance and also project their solidarity when positioned face to face or body to body of individuals that amount to a company of participants. Well, this is not attained by the participants themselves, but as a result of the gathering. I'm trying to avoid the word community because this word entails certain risks. I'd rather use the word gathering as Butler refers to it, since it is all the more powerful in accentuating the individual character of the phenomenon. The second dimension of agency that Butler addresses is a claim for future claims. Future claims for public spheres and public sphere that change it and alter it. When it is voiced, it executes the right of assembly that even if it is not granted to a gathering in the first place. The claim is not only about change that is to ensue in the future, but a claim for bodies appearing in a space to which they are not entitled and executing a right to which they are not entitled either. This can be referred to women's strikes in 2020, which were held despite the ban of public gatherings in Poland, and which nonetheless occurred against the rules instituted by the government. So these gatherings, by their very occurrence, determine and establish a future they want to fight for. They don't express it because the very appearance of gatherings translates into politicality and a delimitation.
Szczególnie udanych protestów alternatywne radykalnie, to znaczy
when it comes to radical protests that cannot be even envisioned or possible now or in the future, performativity in the first meaning, so constructivity of certain relations, not only in a gathering, but also constructivity with reference to the shape of reality and the tensions experienced by individuals, experienced as possible. It's not only about the act of defiance to the current state of affairs. Performativity is about experiencing and producing significance that is envisioned as utopian or impossible. So it's about the protest itself as a performative act rather than about those who participate in it, about the demonstrating individuals. So this new reality or this experience of performativity is created not so much by individuals, but out of itself. And it is aimed at reshaping reality in a way that will render it as close to the experience as possible. It is just so happens that among the examples we could invoke in the Polish context, the best example for these theses, as argued by Judith Butler, is the strongest Polish protest after 1989. That is the manifestations after the Smolensk plane crash in 2010. And I don't mean the morning demonstrations around the countries, but the protests that involved people afterwards. Piotr Dobrowolski mentioned a sense of frustration or protest fatigue or lack of projected responses that is featured in all protests whenever they are pitted against the stubbornness of change at the political plane. If we can recall those protests after the Smolensk plane crash in 2011, 2012, 2013, and the rather scornful and sarcastic attitudes they met with, people who participated in them were treated as wackos in the public discourse. However, those so-called wackos were strong enough in order to galvanize into a movement and take or help and take over power in the country. Now, what is key in this context is that these gatherings should create a strong experience founded not only in the context of the Smolensk plane crash, not only about the respect to the dead, but about the performative strength of the protest, which brought a rather astounding political triumph and a certain indigenous performative of this is Poland, as it was voiced by the performers. So reinstatement of the myth of Poland as a sacrificial entity that sacrifices itself both for those who constitute it and those outside of Poland. So it's a Christological figure of sorts. Now, when speaking of the power of gatherings, they are all the stronger when they are revisited by the phantoms of the past. So very shortly, if we look at the women's strikes in Poland, that are a fundamental topic of our analysis in terms of staging a successful or performing a successful protest, they contain the typically Slavic elements, that is the turn towards the past and the recurring claims towards the future and changes therein. Attached to these protests has been a frustrating sense of lack of agency, because not only have they not yielded the projected changes, but also contributed to a sense of threat that has been used by the current ruling party as a tool of galvanization of their own supporters through fear and by instituting fear-based policies that pits these possible changes against those feeling threatened by the very vision out there.
We could also say that we could also put forth arguments that the fragility was taken over by the brutality of police attacks. It was taken over by the authorities to demonstrate the Marxist and fascist pleasure in the use of violence itself, and that violence that belongs to the state and demonstrated in the spirit of the power is us. If you want to do something, you need to be with us. This is the message of our ruling government. It does mean that women did not have their own performative emotions. And the concluding hypothesis, and this may be definitely a subject for discussion, it seems that what we have established through protests of women is the radical perception of the divergence of two models of reality. The model represented by the authority is paradoxically seen as fictitious. Real problems, real life, what we do on a daily basis is on the protesters' side rather than on the government side. The government is busy creating the fiction of their own authority. The problems of real men and women are taken over by the protesters, not only those who protest for the sake of human rights, climate rights, and everything. I believe that well, when miners went on strike and they put forth climate slogans, I believe that we are feeling in some kind of fiction. This is a radical divergence of two realities, which is responsible for the fact that on the protesters' side, we deal with the process of building an alternative reality, which may soon become real. There is no work on the change of the first reality of the authority, because they disregard this reality as totally irrelevant. The field of game is clearly delineated. Now, I know that it may be risky to claim that the real performativeness of protests is that they change, that they effect change not exactly where we expected, as the stone thrown by the builders who was the cornerstone. Thank you so much. And the final speaker for this session is going to be Joanna Bednarek, guilty signs, guilty banners, protest, scandal, legitimacy. I'm going to say that there was a lot of materials. I'm also going to limit myself to only one fragment. Symbols, signs, and slogans used during the manifestation. Most of them are strange, but there is an interesting pattern of the last 2 decades. The prosecution authority was notified about a possible crime happening. The lightning bolts of the women's strike were identified with an SS symbol, and there were also other signs. I must say that we deal here with a constellation of disparate elements, but let me mention at the beginning, and I do it because I feel respect for the lawyers taking part in our discussion. I'm not going to discuss the legal case here, but I'm going to refer to some mechanisms and patterns. Through this history, I'm going to show what I understand as scandal. The basic question to be asked is, why do some banners are scandalous and others do not? Others are not. Okay, why are banners guilty? Why do they break the law? They break the law, they break different legal instruments, they offend someone's religious beliefs. Why are they particularly guilty? We also had during women's strikes and protests slogans on banners that bore other signs that recreated, for example, the Solidarity logo or the logo of the Home Army during the Second World War. Were not guilty because they broke the law, but they were guilty because they violated the right power or the power culture. Power identity is something I want to use to define scandal. The two are very similar, and for the sake of today's discussion, I'm only going to limit myself to what is official and legitimized by institutions. They generate an invisible network. I suggest that we understand scandal as a violation of a power structure. We so we have a reaction of people who defend the power culture. To have more time for discussion on all papers, I will only refer to only one side, and maybe I will talk about other things later. Fighting Polish woman is part of all the other signs referring used by women's strikes. Yesterday we heard about this. They spoke about the Polish hegemonic discourse, which values wartime virtues and values. Women were the symbolic representatives of the national cause. Woman as the epitome of mother homeland, and the other as mother Poland, or the Polish mother. Maternity was the biological reproduction of the national community. The dominant narrative was undermined by by the banners used during the protests. Against all the obvious differences, the images are not that different. Both banners refer to the events and symbols that are a major tool for legitimizing and delegitimizing power. The wartime conspiracy and uprising imagination is the root cause of the behavior, the patterns of behavior in Polish culture. Both provoked outrage in observers, and they provoked an intervention of the police, and the matter was subordinated to the prosecution authority. We had a number of trials related to the fighting Polish woman, because these symbols were used by a number of protests in different places. There is a certain law that shows that the symbol of fighting Poland is protected by law, by a specific law signed into law by President Komorowski, and it is all citizens of Poland are duty bound to protect this sign, and the courts in Szczecin and Warsaw acquitted the women holding the banners. The court in Kielce fined the protesters. It is very much telling that Justice Łukasz Wiliński raised that there was no specific interpretation of the relevant legal provisions or earlier jurisprudence, and it means that if you don't have interpretation, you need to refer to other interpretations. They refer to the interpretation of provisions related to the slander of Polish national symbols, flag and emblem. In the justification of his verdict, the judge said that we might, during protests, compare the fight during World War II and the fight taken up by different social groups in the defense of what they believe are non-respected rights. The judge said that these activities could be seen as an abuse of these signs and symbols, but they are not a libel against them. In light of this judicial justification, it is more important to hold a discussion on what is permissible under the law. The asymmetry as to the use of the symbol of the fighting Poland and the banner held by women during the Black protest wanted to extend the symbols used. It was a minimum intervention. There were only 2 dots added, but the significance was far different. Scandal. It is a scandal. The very subversive gesture is a scandal. The use of 2 symbolic figures, that is the use of the symbol of Mother Poland and the remodeling of the sign interferes into the dominant symbolic system, which is rooted in the traditional system of values. In light of the historical policy, there is no difference between the participation of women in different uprisings. However, it doesn't mean that the symbols used during these uprisings can be used by women at present. A woman who is a national hero can be only of a supportive role to the dominant masculine discourse. And reproduction is the most important thing, and that's why the symbols can be used by football fans in stadia, even though you have many references to inciting to hatred and racism, and this does not belittle the memory of the wartime heroes. However, the whole thing changes when women can use the signs. So it's not that we deal with an obscene gesture. It's not only about the fight for the autonomy of one's body. If the sign of the fighting Poland was used by women with a breast cancer, would they be charged with libel to national symbols? Probably I would not, I don't see this as libel or abuse. So we could say that in this sense, the power culture would not be violated. However, the use of this sign during Black protests was a sign of a drive to move towards the identity project. The identity project arises, according to casters, when social actors redefine their positions and change the social structure, and the moment when we deal with an identity project can be the moment after a rally, after a demonstration. This would be the model realization of the scandals. The main narrative of protest was not aimed at a particular provision of law. The choice of the tactics neutralizing the scandal shows the stakes. Referring to law is potentially the most effective action neutralizing scandal. Something becomes valid when action aiming at invalidating it becomes null and void. We want to expand these regulations by new provisions. We want to be able to use provisions of law This is all important because the choice of defense tactics strengthens power. In light of what I said, nearly all protests, irrespective of the banners you hold and the slogans you chant, is scandalous. And I would like to share my concern with the risk of misappropriation. This is a social drama. After a moment of disruption, we have a return to established norms and the established order, but this return is never the same. The fact that the old reality is never the same does not mean Bourdieu also saw it and said that fight for the monopoly for righteousness. Each new banner which is arrested by members, representatives of the government is also something that builds the power in the discourse. The dream of the banner would be to be arrested because it would confirm the righteousness of its action. Thank you. Speak.
Otworzę tutaj dyskusję. Chciałem też
now it's time for our Q&A session. And according to the plan, we're only left with 10 minutes for our discussion. However, we're going to extend this session for the next 35 minutes until 25 past 1. I have a short question to Dorota concerning the reaction to Brett Bailey's piece after the scandal. What was his strategy? Did he want to defend himself? Did he want to rescind in any respect, or did he stick to his guns? What was the strategy employed by the author of Exhibit B? Okay.
Czy to jest zabrania głosu? Nie.
We shall take questions from the floor directly first, and then we will give the floor for those in the online audience. I'll start with Dorota and the commodification or objectification. You mentioned in your presentation that objectification can be perceived emotionally or intellectually. Emotionally, it involves fear. As far as my psychological knowledge is concerned, pure intellectual processing of objectification is a certain distortion, diversion from the norm. And as a person that deals with alienation from a philosophical standpoint, I'd like to ask you if you actually take into account the possibility of only handling objectification intellectually without considering it emotionally and the implications it carries. Obviously, this might be taken out of context. I'd like to squeeze you a little bit into providing the answer towards non-emotional reactions towards objectification of humans. I should also thank you for addressing this very intriguing theatrical initiative or performance. I have also dealt with counterpublics, as you know, and my students have pushed the envelope a little bit further with reference to Klątwa piece performed in Warsaw, which also involved certain categories of protest in terms of claims for recognition of subjectivity. Now, on to Ryszkusiński. I wanted to ask him about agency, because I do think that Butler and her theory of performative acts and performativity makes a lot of sense. I myself am all for the recognition of non-heroic agency and see the potential lying therein, but I'm also interested in how to process different sorts of agency and the synergies between agency and different political results. And I disagree that it is difficult, if not impossible, to take over power without sending one's representatives to the streets to protest. I do agree with many of your points, but I do see today's protest as heroic, and their agency is similar to parliamentary agency because it involves a lot of legislative or legal aspects, and on the other hand, our MPs act as if they were in the streets sometimes. So I also want to consider protests of feminists or different civic rights movements, and whether we want to create non-hierarchical relations during protests and use it to create equity in society, even though it seems utopian. And how do we generate this sense of equity during protests through consciously adopted strategies? So it's not as unpredictable in terms of the results that are embedded in protests. And these are my comments and questions to the respective speakers. Okay, now we'll give the floor to Agnieszka Graf. Thank you very much. All three panelists provided us with fascinating points. And I'd like to start with Dariusz Kosiński when he accused, so to speak, the sort of interpretation that I offered in my yesterday's presentation, my yesterday's paper, which supposedly omitted the performative aspect. And while I did omit this aspect, I absolutely agree with you that the performative framework is something that offers us wider insight into the nature of the phenomena inspected. My question would be, where would you locate the reading of different symbols within performative interpretation? Would you agree with me that these articulations voiced in 2016 during the first women's protest in Poland, which featured a lot of patriotic symbols used and processed and employed in different means, are different to a large extent performatively to the protests of 2020, in which what was performed was the lack of adequate language. Don't want to imply by any means that the language of football fans was to enable performance to slip into the shoes of football fans and adopt similar measures. Not at all. I like your thesis of this radical incongruence between the world of power and it being out of touch with reality. I think that this could be seen in the later wave of protests, whereas the first ones, although not as radical, were more successful politically, because the first wave of women's protests in 2016 were the only successful ones throughout the first term and the beginning of the second term of Law and Justice rule, as it resulted in the withdrawal of the anti-abortion project from the parliament. Nonetheless, I'd like to congratulate you on your wonderful interpretation of these events, and I'd like to ask you whether you take into account the possibility of embedding the Polish fighting woman as a disruption to the dominant hegemonic discourse and culture, in reference to post-colonial and gender theories, and the overarching principle of the national objectification of the woman's body as part of the logics of metaphor, and what this logic entails, that is the logic of metonymy. So the woman is a symbol of a nation, but individual women demonstrating as representatives of society are not actively involved or admitted to this overarching narrative. The fundamental characteristic of the Polish fighting woman was the massive performance of the theme by individual women, and different acts of disruption. For example, the disruption of the nationalistic demonstration on Independence Day by the so-called Black Sluts collective. And it seems to me that this theme of the fighting Polish woman was employed by protesting women on a mass scale. Other than that, I'd like to pay my utmost respect and the recognition of your fascinating presentation. And the comments in particular on disruptions of purity, seriousness, and solemnity of the Warsaw Uprising anchor as an untouchable symbol, so to speak, a non-negotiable one. Okay, last chance to ask questions before they're answered.
prosić o alfabetycznie odpowiedzi, więc pani od razu zada
Okay,
pytanie.
I'd like you to both ask your question and address the ones pitched to you. So my first question would be to Professor Kosiński, and the notion of patience that he touched upon, the notion of patience that overlapped with all of your theses in your paper, and the comments on whether or not protests can get things done or provoke change in a shorter or longer perspective. Obviously, these phenomena are helpful in explicating the reality we perform and exist in. And referring to Peter Sloterdijk, they also can help conceive of the bank of rage that can be postponed, deposited at a bank, and when we think of a Christian rage bank, it could be capitalized on by God himself on Judgment Day. Obviously, philosophically or systemically, this bank of rage wouldn't be as big, but wouldn't it be a certain threat towards protest if we thought that we can protest and take to the streets for a certain cause without really getting changes done, but rather to deposit our rage to a rage bank of sorts? Since we don't have the potential or tools to handle a given issue adequately. I don't know if you'd agree with this accumulative aspect of anger and rage. This is it as far as my question is concerned. And now on to my answer. Thanks to you, Agnieszka Graf, for all of your kind words and comments on my presentation and on legitimizing my points or validating them, so to speak. When it comes to theory, I have not taken the theorists you mentioned into account, but it would definitely be aware of the post-colonial and gender aspects of my criticism of these guilty banners, guilty signs, especially with reference to the Black protests, where we should also differentiate between woman as a symbol generated by male-centric narratives or culture and individual women as individuals who expressed their dissatisfaction and discontent with individual customized banners. For example, the uterus transformed into a "fuck you" sign. So again, focusing on individuality rather than on the symbolic layer of these signs entailed in presentations and demonstrations, excuse me. Now, on the margins of your comment, I'd like to say that I'll definitely include these theoretical points in my further research. And your mention of the anecdote and scandal caused by the so-called Black Sluts activists that disrupted the nationalist demonstration in Warsaw, I think it could be subverted in as a Bakhtinian category and create an incongruous gesture that will be misread or feature an utterance that will be misinterpreted and feature a looped act of communication. So in this case, the fact that one of the representatives of this nationalist group thought that these Black Sluts were their allies for the duration of the demonstration is particularly striking.
Thank you so much for the questions and all the comments made. I'll try to respond jointly to the questions put by Agnieszka Graf and Eva. I do not know if this is a problem, the relationship between a declared, the overt political objective and something that is independent of the participants of the process. I believe that the paradox of protests is that the most important thing is what we do not plan on. Understand that the law on tightening abortion, the permissibility of abortion was important. We had remember the sign, the black umbrellas. Nobody believed, nobody had expected them to be used as a symbol. It happened that it was raining the day, and women had black umbrellas, and now when Majeska says about the intention of using a new network of political relations, I immediately think that this scenario is very risky. That paradoxically, when we do not plan on it, this kind of new reaction can be created, and it can be effective because it is unplanned. We simply created a new formula of being together, of collaboration. The most effective thing is what emerges within the protest itself, what is somewhat improvised. And we deal here with a set of different ideas. We deal here with the relationship between the recreation of the text and what happens with the text in the creative process. Contemporary theater can use a variety of strategies, but there is this tension between the script and what happens during the improvisation, during the interpretation. And very often, at the end of the day, sometimes the intended outcome was negated. But I believe that the efficiency of the protest cannot be really established once and for all. The rain during the Black protest was the non-human actor of the protest, and these agents, these non-human agents are impossible to plan, impossible to foresee. Actually, we never know until the end whether everything will fine. Are not certain whether protests will be successful. This is also linked to the question posed by Anna Bednarik about patience. Yes, we deal with this continuous risk. Each new attempt at change generates anger, but also creates this mechanism of a projection of the future, that this will happen someday, perhaps not during our lifetime, but one day. And I try to offer us all a little bit of hope, which is hard to do because we are somehow happy to wait for the apocalypse. And if so, then we don't need to be active. This is obviously a temptation, which is masochistic, bliss, a masochistic pleasure. We are trying to find arguments. I am trying to find arguments that will help us believe that change is possible. We are at a time when we had the Smolensk protests, which generated a social movement as of 2015. We can also put forth arguments that Smolensk demonstrations were scripted, well scripted. They were a Christianized version of solidarity, this first solidarity experience. In the case of women's protests, the situation is more difficult because they are very much into the future, not so much into the past. But their potential of attracting because of the wrath is much more important, much greater than that of Smolensk protests. But we should be using the actors' mechanism of what if. Protests cannot be patient. Protests need to erupt as if they want to effect change immediately, right now. And in the pragmatics of protests, we should move forth the political aim into the future. So we should, as if there was no chance for this postponement. Using symbols or the ways of reading certain elements that are peculiar to symbolic theater studies science. The question is what we do, what a symbol does rather than what it means. What a symbol does, what we do with a symbol, this is far more interesting. To treat a symbol as an actor of a performance, as an actor that contributes specific meanings. You can do this with the lightning bolts that were immediately clicked on and that immediately were used as a stigma. And this is something that is positively valorized. The dynamism of the use of the symbol, where it takes place as an actor of a complex identity. The performative in this way, in this manner, means that things are process-like and that we need to take into consideration the active collaboration of non-human actors of events, for example, space. Space is a unique actor of a protest. The features of a given venue generate specific forces that contribute to the protest. I guess I responded to everything that appeared in the comments. Dorota will respond.
Osobom online mówię, że to jest kawałek drogi do przejścia
Right. As for the first question on Bailey's strategy, the defense strategy was to well, it was two pronged. He referred to his own theory and history of apartheid. He said that he also has every right to tell this story. It was also his story. This was one direction which he used as his defense, and also he transferred the entire discussion to a reflection on what art is to be. Bailey and theater and other European theaters which sent letters of support to Barbican Center. They said that the artists have the right to express themselves, and they defended the right to, they defended the aesthetic vision art, while opponents of the project who took to the streets in London defended the ethical vision. That is, moral judgments being leveled at art, and art being subservient to ethics. So these were the two avenues of defense used by the artist. As for Eva's question, I don't know if I understood you correctly, but well, Bailey wanted to speak about racism and colonialism, invoking the viewer's emotions. And this was effective. All the relations and reviews confirm it. British teachers, or a British teacher, made a note in a book, in a visitor's book, and I believe that this was an entry in this book. This teacher said that he had been teaching about the history of racism and colonialism for many years. It was only when he came to the exhibition with his students were they able to understand what colonialism and racism meant, that it offered them a chance to enter history. But it was also a field of criticism for opponents. I didn't have the time to quote Bailey's opponents, but they accused him of an absence of an intellectual approach to the topic. He did not use the local, the fluid category. There were many arguments leveled against him. There was also the question of how an image is constructed, that the blacks are always exploited to show humiliation, grief. They don't want to be cast in those roles, and Bailey did not give them this chance. He showed the old stereotypical history. Protesters' reaction was very intellectual. In relations in different blogs, expressing their fear, their anger, also showed a lot of elements of interpretation which highlighted what they saw as drawbacks and deficiencies of the project. So that's one thing that calls for discussion, and also the reaction of the actors who took part in the project. They were in favor of Bailey. They backed up Bailey, and they spoke about the power and significance of the project for themselves. You could see this on the slides at the end of each show in each city. Bailey also included the statements by the actors who supported him, saying that it's objectification rather than the subjectification. We still have 3 minutes to go, and I would like to ask a question to Piotr Dobrowolski. You started the panel, spoke about a model of a theater which takes part in protests through the creation of a community, and then we had some doubts. We had different models of the efficiency of art, something that Dorota referred to, something that got out of hand. Our speaker said that he gets the shivers when he hears the term community, because it also brings up negative associations. I was referring here to a project, Kolenda Nocka, during the first Solidarity. I was going to ask you about whether in the contemporary theater in Ukraine, do you see examples of theater participation in current protests?
Thank you very much. I'll start by addressing the notion of community that is often mentioned in the context of affect or public performance, or the effects of public performance, that is. And indeed, the problem with which I grapple with is the durability of community, not the community itself, but rather the arguments posed by the community, or the arguments that bind it together. And this juxtaposition between performativity and theatricality, I have wondered, very much like Dariusz Koszyński did, how theatricality can be performative, and in doing so, how it can get back to what we expect from public gatherings that allow us to jump together, to chant together, and to feel something together, because it is my impression that this public reception of specific demonstration has reverberated yesterday. When it comes to theater, the concept that triggered my ruminations on the engagement of theater as an art and as a public institution, and its commitment, not organization-wise, but as an institution that is engaged in and created for social functions, and the role of actors as participants in the public debate. As a public institution, based on the Ukrainian example, theater gives one a chance to, well, and I digress here, but I am not opposed to depositing rage, as Joanna mentioned. But what I have in mind is the direct implementation of practical political goals. And in this respect, I'd like to believe that rebellion will not go to waste, will not be subject to entropy, as I said in my paper. So I wonder, what can theater do in order to help deposit rage? This is my peculiar point of view as a theatrologist, perhaps not representative of the entire society, but I think that theater is an institution that can be a depository of rage or of rebellion and a catalyst of these performative acts in polysensoric multimedia effects that it can exert on audiences and participants alike. The second thing is modeling of revolutions in the past 3 decades in Ukraine, which I used to point out that organizational evolution of the social institution that theater is can give us hope for a return of certain desires or themes. So it's not only about expressing protest or rebellion on stage and sparking the rebellion directly, but rather about releasing a certain affective and intellectual results that can reveal themselves in social consciousness and that can be carried via the medium of culture, accumulating, reinforcing themselves, or being deposited and released as a tool of potential rebellion. This is just a theoretical model, obviously, but I hope that perhaps it is applicable to a certain extent. Thank you very much. I think this was a pretty positive conclusion voiced by Piotr Dobrowolski. If I may add, there was Jan Klata's rendition of Stanisław Wyspiański's Wedding that was outstandingly structured, but I had deep hopes that the rebellion entailed in the piece would not translate into social action, since it was highly nationalistically and conservatively charged piece. Now, since our audience follows us online on YouTube too, I'd like to refer to Mr. Kucharski's comment posted online, who addressed my paper in a very pertinent comment. Michał Kucharski points out that it is pretty characteristic that the verdicts passed in the matters discussed in my paper were all passed by male judges. Thank you very much. We've got to wind up our panel for now, and we are overdue for a long lunch break, and we shall reconvene at 20 to 3. At 20 to 3, we shall be here for our next